line. Okay, and the ladies from the New Mexico State Poetry Society that are here, we have the president of the group, Bernadette Perez. Do you want to wave here? Okay, and I'm going to start pinning them up on the top so you can see them. There's Bernadette. And then we have JC. Where is JC? Oh, there's Shirley. Oh, there's JC. Okay, so here's JC and Shirley and JC. What's your JC Wayne and Shirley Blackwell? And they all do different types of poetry, and they have different aspects of it that they're going to share with you today. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and I'm really, really grateful that you have stepped in to help us today and to talk about this for us in celebrating Poetry Month.
Thank you. I guess I will start first. I'm Bernadette with the New Mexico Poetry Society, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are. We were founded in 1969. We are affiliated with the National Federation of State Poetry Societies. Right now, we currently have about 140 members, and we have 11 youth members. So we're pretty excited about that because we, with our organization, you can become a youth member at no cost. So we really have a lot of emphasis on the youth, on bringing them to come to our organization due to the fact because they are our future. So it's very important to us that we include them in our society. We recently just had a big event, our state annual convention that we had this last Saturday, and we collaborated with the National Hispanic Cultural Center, and we worked with Carson Morris, who is head of one of the departments there, and it was really fun. It was exciting. It was Earth Day. We had a lot of activities. We had workshops. We had a poetry walk. We did some workshops on expressive poetry. We also had a lot of famous poets that attended. We had some former poet laureate Manny Gonzalez and poet prodigy Sarita Gonzalez, who also attended. On our panel, we had JC Wayne, who is a certified creative aging teaching artist. We also had Carson, who is able to give us a lot of information about who is the director of the history and literary arts. So it's Dr. Carson Morrison. We currently have about 4 chapters with our society who meet on a monthly basis. And in these monthly bases, they perform workshops. They have a lot of insights that they like to bring, poets that can do different varieties. For instance, our Albuquerque chapter met in January, and they brought David Meisen, who helped them give a workshop about submittable and how to submit and how to use submittable. So it was educational for a lot of our poets. Anastasia Anderson, who taught poetry at the UNM Continuing Education. In March, we had Nathan Brown, who is a poet laureate, former poet laureate for Oklahoma. And Nathan also is a singer-songwriter, and how we can collaborate poems with song and songwriting. We also had JC Wayne, who will be coming up in May. So we're really excited because she's going to talk about bringing art and poetry to our youth people. So a lot of this year is about collaborating with a lot of different societies in New Mexico and bringing poetry throughout New Mexico and beyond. So we were really trying to connect with a lot of organizations that are out there. And so hopefully in the future, if you want to connect again, you can contact me at President of New Mexico State Poetry Society. Now, a little bit about my poetry. So I would say I was a closet poet. I wrote for my youth, and then I went ahead and got married, had children, became my grandmother, and then my children found some of my works hidden away. And so they brought them out and said, Mom, you need to bring this out. Why is this all hidden under the beds and in the closets and so forth? So coming out, I've learned that the importance of, like one of your presenters said, about being able to perform and be able to use the mic and be able to not be the little mouse behind the mic. So this is a learning experience that I think not only in writing, in expression. And I think poetry is a lot about bringing expression to the page. Some of my poems are very dark. It's hard to write sometimes of life experiences and to bring those experiences out. And so sometimes we use shadows in my writing. So, you know, we try to cover up what's happened in the past, but in a way it's bringing poetry and writing, whether it's writing poetry or just simply just sitting there and writing and writing and writing and getting all the words out into the page is a relief for me, and it's comforting. So poetry could be a lot of different things. It could be, you know, just a baseline into writing in general. You know, so some of my poems have been published in books, and they only take one part of a poem and put it into a whole entire novel. And I started to do that when I realized, well, they were asking for writing, but they didn't say poetry. So I'm going to give it a shot. And I did, and it worked out just great for me. So sometimes you just have to go past those borders. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say about poetry in my perspective, and just being excited to be president of New Mexico State Poetry Society for as long as I have, and being able to bring poems and poetry through the whole state of New Mexico. And I just hope I can continue doing this a lot more in the future. Shirley, would you like to talk next?
I'd be happy to, but tell me if my voice is good enough. Can you hear me? Okay, great. I'm going to follow up a bit with what Bernadette talked about and kind of advance it a little bit more too. And that is that right now we see the New Mexico State Poetry Society. I'm just going to call it the Society from now on, if that helps everybody. And there's the one other group that Bernadette mentioned, which is the National Federation of State Poetry Societies, our sort of mothership, which has some 38 state affiliates under it, is I'll call the Federation, because when I start stringing it all out, the fact that NMSPS and NFSPS are so closely related as far as acronyms are concerned, everybody will get confused. So what we do is what the society has turned to since I have been since I've known it, at least, is it started out back in 2008 when I joined it. It was something of a society that you think of as a very genteel society where people get together and read flowery poems and so forth. And it's changed a great deal since then. We have, gosh, I guess we've more than doubled our, we've more than doubled our membership. And what we have really done is expand to every genre that there is. I think anybody who, of any level, who wants to be in the society and who writes any kind of poetry is welcome. We don't concentrate on one sort of thing. What has really entered our life as a society recently and the life of the Federation is that we have been reaching out to spoken word, uh, everything that derived from hip hop and slam to now performance poetry. And over the past several years, we have been trying to bring that into the Federation with a couple of programs. The first started out as it was called the Blackberry Peach Poetry Prizes for Poetry Spoken and Heard. And the idea behind this was to bring together stage and page poets, because the stage poets were saying to us that they didn't feel quite accepted as as a, an authentic kind of poetry. And the page poets were the ones that were, being talked about before as the ones that mumbled into their reading. And we thought that so the slam poets, the spoken word poets, they told us that they wanted to learn the craft. They wanted to learn the techniques, the poetics. And I'm not sure that any of our page poets were willing to say it, but it was very easy to observe that they needed some help in performance and in projecting their poetry. So we brought together, first of all, a national contest in which in which contestants submitted an audio version of 4 poems up to 3 minutes, which were the outlines of slam poetry. And they had to submit that only in the audio. They couldn't do it visually. We didn't want the costumes or anything like that overriding the voices of these people. And then they also had to submit what I guess you would call a script of what they had read. It was a transcript of the poems that they were doing. And that poetry had to stand up on the page. And what we did with the winners of those different prizes is that we put them into a book, a chapbook, and we put all of the winners in there together. And with biographies of them, they got cash prizes for some of this. That we put them on YouTube channels where people could go and see them, and that went on for about that went on from 2017 is when we ran the first one until last year in 2022 we had our first NFSPS Federation Blackberry Peach National Slam Championship in Daytona Shores, Florida, and 40 poets all over the nation gathered there, and they crowned a first, second, and third place person for each of those prizes for those, and that was all done like a typical slam thing. Now, we had our national convention in June of last year, and then we had the Blackberry Peach National Slam in October. And what we found was that did not that there were people who couldn't afford to go to both of those. So what we did was the Federation decided to unite them. This year in Des Moines, Iowa, in June, we will be running those two programs parallel to each other. And there will be plenty of opportunity for people who are going to the traditional convention to take part in some of the slam activities and vice versa. And so that's one thing we're doing on the national level to really um, start trying to unite these people and give them the credentials that they have earned over some 40 years or so of slam poetry, which has managed to mature very much as its own art form. Um, so, anyway, that's a little bit about what we have been doing. And the society has also been reaching out in so many other ways when we can partner with other organizations such as your own. We have the Poets Picnic in May, which is, I think, our last gathering of that had uh, some 300 folks who came in. And what we do in that one is we team up with the Calligraphy Society, and if you can help me out, Bernadette, can you remember what the other group is? There's one that anyway. There's a Calligraphy Society. Oh yes, and the bookmakers, book binders, book creators. And what we do is there's a contest where we all send in very tiny poems of one kind or another, haiku or just little 10-word poems. The calligraphers select the ones that they like, and they put them onto strips of biodegradable paper, and they also put them in a select few into a book that is a handmade book. And then we all get together. The what they call the weathergrams are small poems written on strips of basically grocery bags, are hung in the trees at the Albuquerque open space. And when you walk in, you don't know where your poem is exactly in that. So you wind up reading everybody else's poem, trying to find your own. It's a great way to spread poetry. And it's a wonderful coming together of people. Then, as Bernadette said, we really did partner with the Hispanic Center to bring poetry to. They had a family day running at the same time for the Earth Day. And what we did was to bring the people who came for their Earth Day and invite them into an ekphrastic workshop and also one of the poetry walks that JC will talk about. And so, anyway, I hope I've told a little bit more about what we are doing now. And I know that you have members of ours there. As a matter of fact, Irene, I know that she signed up for coming to our event at the thing. I don't know if I had a chance to meet her there. I was kind of busy, but I do see that she is in this anthology that we have just published called Glissando, and these are our society members who contributed poems. And anyway, these are the people who had attended the previous state convention, whose theme was transition. And glissando is a musical transition between notes. And so anyway, that's how it got its title. And Irene's poem is right in there, right behind mine, actually. Those of us whose names start with B got a first place showing in that one. So there you go. Here she is. I'm glad to see you up there, Irene.
Hello. I'm glad to hear that. This is the first I've heard of it.
Really?
Really?
Oh,
Yeah.
no. Oh no. Well, you know that you'll have one of these. And
I
so
will.
okay, I will tell you and I will tell everybody else out there.
Where
The
do
way
I
to
get
find
it?
the way to find out about this is to go to our website. That's www.southwest, www.nmpoetry.com. And that will take you to, it will tell you about a whole bunch of other things that are happening. And Bob Cadera, you might like to know this. If you have any poetry events going on, or any of your other members of your group who are poets, first of all, you're invited to come and join us so that you get all this great ideas. But if you have any poetry events going, you should know that the New Mexico State Poetry Society has a calendar page that is open to anybody in New Mexico who has a poetry event. They don't have to be members of the society to advertise their event for free on our calendar. And that is something that, you tell all of your other poetry friends if they have an event happening. It can be book signings, or a release, or readings, whatever you're doing. That is a service that we offer to everyone who's interested in poetry in New Mexico. Okay, so with all that said about that, I guess I was supposed to talk about poetry. And so on. But if I may, actually, I would like to read. I would like to read a poem of mine, and it's because it has something to do with what I'm going to say, which is, in a way, what's it like to be a poet? I'm not going to be able to teach you about poetry, everything you need to know tonight. You can spend a semester or two, if you want to, at some university learning about that, and it'll take that long. Some of it will. But what I'd like to really kind of talk about is perhaps telling a little bit of my story as a poet and the lessons I kind of learned along the way. Okay. And then I will preface this one poem I'm going to do by saying that what I did in retirement. I wrote poetry as a youth, and up until the time I got married and got a career, and then it kind of became something I did for parties, and and I like to write. I sort of like to write humorous stuff. I also am very much a formalist, because I learned my poetry after I changed from being a journalism major to being an English major, because I thought that I might really learn how to write the kind of stuff I wanted to write as an English major instead. Then I had my career, I retired, I was bored, I happened into a poetry meeting, and I took a weekend workshop at Mountain Air, and there I met Greg Candela, and he was teaching poetry down at the Valencia campus of UNM, and he said, Shirley, you can come to my poetry class down here, and you can come in and do this. And I thought, okay, I don't have anything else to do. I was bored. So I went down there, I enrolled in his poetry class, and absolutely got the bug. And I went into him one time because I had studied poetry. I knew, I had a pretty good grasp of the mechanics, I thought. And so I wrote some stuff for him, and I went in and I asked him one time, well, what do you think of my poetry? And he said, well, Shirley, you've got the mechanics of it okay, but what I'd like to see is a little more heart in your poetry. So I went home that night and I thought, okay, how am I going to do this? And I was struggling, and I'd write a poem, and then I'd kind of throw it in the wastebasket. And my husband came through the door and he said, "What are you doing tonight?" And I said, "Well, I'm supposed to write a sonnet." And I said, "I don't know." I said, "I've been wrestling with this doggone thing forever." And that was when a light went on. And so I wrote this piece, and it has kind of become, it's kind of become a guidepost for me. Okay, it's called Wrestling Match, with apologies to Erato being the muse of lyric poetry. And there are a couple of other terms in here. I'm not going to define them. I'm just going to mention them. These are a little more esoteric. You all know what a metaphor is, I am sure. There are a couple of other metrical feet. One of them is spondee and one is an anapest. And you all probably know what iambs are right now. Iambic pentameter being the standard for most of the poetry that we see that's formal, or at least a lot of it. And those are only so you understand what I'm saying here. So, wrestling match. The task was simple, just to write a sonnet. But inspiration dodged, then ducked for cover. I mused, then thought, I'll put my muse right on it, and phoned Erato. "Hey, babe, dash on over." No coy mistress she, but bellicose. No simile caressed her lips or glance. Before I had the chance to wax verbose, she crouched behind the words in wrestler stance. She sprang at me in anapestic anger. I responded with a spondee body slam. When her metaphor half Nelson spelled out danger, I pinned her to the mat with 5 iambs. She spat, "You know the throws. You've got the holes. But tell me, can you pen the poet's soul?" So that was written in my favorite form of poetry, which is a sonnet. And I have done some workshops on sonnets, one called Slaying the Dragon, Conquering Your Fear of Sonnets, because I have found that sonnets are something that you do the way you eat an elephant, which is one verse at a time. And so anyway, it's that. But that is, and then I want you to kind of know about this idea of being able to capture the poet's soul. Because if we write poetry that doesn't connect, doesn't somehow have that tiny bit of universality to it that relates to other people, then I don't think that we've done our job. Okay, so as I said, I had gone through, through youth and career and into retirement, and never did anything serious with poetry, and never thought of it seriously as a way of life. Now, I often wondered a couple of things. I have a husband who plays the fiddle. He plays bluegrass, and he plays Scots fiddling, and he plays lots of other stuff. Here in Valencia County, there's a group called Fiddlers and Musicians. And that falls into the same sort of category for me as poets and musicians. poets and writers. And I always wondered, why is there a distinction? Why do they make this distinction between fiddlers and aren't fiddlers musicians? Aren't poets writers? And I've been exploring that idea and learning some things along the way. One of the things that happen is, now, for me, poetry is something I can choose to do. I can choose to sit down and write a poem. I can choose to use a form and write to that form. And that is something I like to do because for me, writing a poem is it's an intellectual exercise as much as it is an emotional exercise. But what I learned along the way is that a whole lot of poets don't think about it that way. I have heard so many people who say, poetry saved my life. If I hadn't, or I've heard them say, I simply had to get the words out. This was the only way I could do it. I've heard them say that I have to write. I can't stop writing. And particularly if they're going through a period of turmoil or difficulty or sadness or some of these things. And if you notice, people who have never written poems in their lives will write them or try to write them for things like funerals, for things like celebrating something. They try to, young men try to write love poetry because people somehow want to turn to poetry to express the things in their lives that are the most important. They realize that there's some way that poetry connects with the listener in a way that prose may not. And so anyway, and so I wondered why that is. It's because a poet, okay, I've written other things. I wrote government reports for 20 years, people. I wrote things on science and technology, and I wrote handbooks on things, how to do this or that. A lot of stuff that was very, straightforward, not much imagination allowed in it or anything like that. And I realized that you use a different part of your brain when you are writing, when you're writing something that is nonfiction, or when you're writing a story. A writer, at least in the kind of writing I had to do in my career, I knew before I started where I was going to have to end up. That's not the way with poetry. Poetry has a way of taking you on a journey, and you don't always know. I mean, Robert Frost said it. He says, I never began a poem knowing where I will end up. And it's because it can become a very organic thing. And you use this part of your brain that is willing to believe or imagine the impossible very often. And writing a poem is a journey. It's not a destination. So anyway, I think I've probably taken so much more of my time than I really was allotted. But I will kind of end it there. I will invite you all to visit the society, to become members. We allow people to be members of other societies and groups too at the same time. And the other thing that I wanted to say is thank you for your past help. There were a number of people in the Southwest Riders some years ago who answered John Candelaria's call for people who would come out and help us do something called our Poets in the Classroom, where we gave riders a little bit of training about how to interact in the public schools. And then it was something like at one time we had something like 50 poets. And I know they weren't all poets. There were some of you who came along for the ride and helped us go out to, I think it was 5 elementary and middle schools in Albuquerque, where the kids got a chance to really hear some poetry, and then their work was taken and combined with some of the artwork that they presented for it, and the society managed to put that all together, publish books of the children's poetry and art, and gave that to the teachers who were teaching them poetry. And with that, and knowing that JC is somebody who has worked so much with this idea of taking poetry not just in the classroom, but outside the classroom, I will turn it over to you, JC. Thank you. Thank you all for having us tonight. We appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much. I am so honored to be here and to be able to be with all of you tonight. I am going to do some screen sharing, and I have to say that I was particularly intrigued and noodling on the question of is poetry nature or nurture? And so I will, I want to talk a little bit about that and through the lens of my own experience. And so I hope you can all see my screen. I am a visual artist and a poet and an editor and a book doula and a poetry adventure guide. And so I wear a lot of hats, but the encompassing identity that I have is really as a cartographer of the unseen. And for me, combining art and poetry is my mapping tool to create these cartographies of the unseen. And I just wanted to, the cover, this is a painting that I did in New Mexico last year. And the title gives a little taste to how I use poetry, which is finding beauty in cleansing fire. This painting was inspired by my being here during the massive fires last year in May. And so much of what I think poetry does that is kind of innate to its very being is that it brings perspectives that are perhaps different, that are expanded understandings and insights and new ways of seeing things. It's such an interesting question what poetry is, and going back to Dan's introduction, I do not put hard lines between writing and poetry. I have done technical writing. I have created directories. I was a long-range 10-year strategic futurist in Silicon Valley in my first career. And I kind of apparently popped out of the womb writing poetry and doing art. My grandmother kept a drawing that I did with magic markers by her bedside for her entire life that I did at age 1 that looked like a Cézanne. And I wrote poetry as soon as I could speak. And so in my case, poetry was very much nature, but it is also a nature that has evolved and been nurtured. And so one thing that has occurred to me and that I've experienced when people meet me and they hear that I write poetry or that I'm a poet, there's a certain aura that kind of descends on their perception, that somehow poetry is magic and poets are magicians somehow. And I don't encounter that when I'm interfacing with people as a writer, whether it's a writer of children's books or a writer of technical papers, writer of articles, writer of blog posts, writer of memoirs, whatever the form of writing is. But I think that there is a universal cultural perception that poetry is somehow, whether one has a spiritual lens or not, poetry expresses the sacred. And in a lot of ways, I've experienced that no matter who people are in life, when they turn to poetry, poetry is a form of secular prayer. And I am a certified creative teaching artist, and I also work with 5- and 6-year-olds, and just did at the convention for the society, we did a poetry of nature walk along the bosque, and we had a 4-year-old and we had an 85-year-old. And I do not engage people in poetry differently if they're 4 or if they're 85. I have a very universal approach. And even though I'm very formally trained, I am totally not a formalist when it comes to poetry. I am an agent of play, of liberating creativity, of discovering the adventure of poetry. And so I combine nature, being outdoors in nature, with poetry and art as much as possible. But there's definitely this sense and the experience that I had, because I was part of my creative aging work was providing what were called creative care kits and creative companions during lockdown. I divide my time among Vermont, Chicago, and New Mexico. And so I was in Vermont for all of COVID lockdown. And so in order to help support the elders in very remote rural places in Vermont, we created basically lesson plans, activities, creative activities, and I created a whole series on different subject inspired poetry. So we had art inspired poetry, science inspired poetry, music inspired poetry, nature inspired poetry, etc. And what was fascinating was that many of the people who were participating, we had to do it we got together via Zoom. And many of the people that were participating were elder women who had literally just lost companions of 60 years, 50 years to COVID. And what was incredible was that they came together in community with poetry as a balm for what they were going through. And so there is this sacredness that I can't really, I can't put a pat definition or a technical definition on why poetry has this sense of sacredness. But in my case, as a poet, I have always sensed that life is abundant and magical. And I think poets, I can put on my writer hat, and I can put on my poet hat, and I can put on my visual artist hat. And what I can say that as a visual artist and a poet, what is shared in those spaces is that as a poet, I am a walking ball of sensory input and output. And so I think that that's something that's very poetic, is that essentially we can't even turn that off. Our very nature is that we are so infused with our environment, so at one with whatever we're experiencing, that we are constantly registering information, and anything around us is poetic and can be made into a poem. And I have always had a very profound sense of wonder. And that's two forms of wonder: the wonder in the sense of awe, and the wonder in the sense of wondering. And so for me as a poet, and something that I see shared among poets, is that every moment in life, everything we encounter is a story that we wonder about. And that when we don't have a lot of data, we make that story up through poetry. And so for me, I have a very strong sense of place. And in my early life, poetry was not something, I was born doing it. It was a vocabulary and a language that I had innately. I did come from a very cultural, intellectual family, but they didn't teach me poetry. I just did it naturally. And so I found that even from my earliest years, poems or poetic phrases were like Polaroid snapshots. to capture the memory of really special experiences. And that has stayed with me my entire life. No matter what age I am, no matter what experience I'm having, they are these little jewel boxes that I take out, and I can read one word or one phrase in a poem, and I am back in that moment or back in that realization with every single sense that I was experiencing at that time. The smell, the temperature, was the sun out? Was I hearing dragonflies? Was I hearing the plop of bullfrogs dropping off the lilies in Walden Pond? I am right there in a very electric way. And so part of that cartography of the unseen is those intangible things. I mean, what is a memory? It is what we make up. It is what we remember. And so for me, poetry is a way of recording that experience in real time, and then having, it's almost like shorthand notes to bring back the entirety and the holistic universality of that experience. So I think that's part of what poetry is. It is essentializing. It is shorthand for the essential. It is shorthand for the universal. And in my own sort of progression as a poet and the cartography of the unseen, the nature part was that I popped out poetic. The nurture part was that life has delivered me many, many experiences. And I like to say that I am a recovering dual, I am a continuing 57-year-old dual Ivy League graduate in recovery. And so a lot of my trajectory has been busting out of being a product of the Ivy League, with due respect to what it gave me, and becoming my 5-year-old playful self, which is 100% who I was before I got into the school system and became very, very good at being a student. So part of my trajectory into the nurture part was that I always had a sense, even when because I didn't have a lot of training in poetry, and I come from an intensely secular family, nonetheless, I always felt when I was writing poetry that there was something larger than myself moving the pencil or the pen. And I was the tip of the pencil or the pen, or I was the recording instrument. And there was something really big going on that I didn't fully understand, that was trying to tell a story through me. And that has only intensified as I've grown in wisdom and in years. And so it's very interesting that as a poet, of course, the stock and trade is words, and my mission for the poetry project is building loving worlds through loving words and art. So I host an ekphrastic voicing art poetry reading series that is specifically designed to provide a positive space for people to wield words consciously as forces of good in this very weird world that we're living in right now. And I trained to be a diplomat. My degrees are in international relations, and I was in Hungary when the Berlin Wall fell. And so the world that we're living in now is not at all what I ever expect could happen. It's what my grandparents and parents came up through in World War II and Korea. And so this whole world that we're in now, it is I think only my sense of the universal that is helping me navigate it. So ironically, the fact that words are stock and trade, when I thought about what is writing and what is poetry, what came to mind was a visual. And so again, I have no hard and fast rules. Poetry is writing, writing is poetry. And I totally agree. I love the idea of prosaic poetry and poetic prose. That is my experience. But when I started to think about how can I encapsulate what my experience is as a writer and what my experience is as a poet, what came to mind is that writing in many ways can be represented by George Seurat's afternoon, Sunday in the Park. The full title is much longer, but the whole field of pointillism and art is not only lots of tiny dots, but what Seurat did that was absolutely incredible was he was a product of the time in which science was making progress in leaps and bounds. And he deeply went into the science of light and optics and color theory. And so not only was he putting all of these tiny dots, which you probably can't really see too well on my screen, in profusion, every single surface covered in dots. It was completely mapped and planned out from start to finish, and every dot is applied according to color theory, so that the intersection of particular colors creates a literal optical vibration that creates movement and creates a new color that we see with the eye in this painting. This to me was an embodiment of writing. So much incredible technical thoughtfulness, planning, deep knowledge and understanding of technique, deep knowledge and understanding in the case of art of how optics and light and illumination work, how they interact, what creates an optical vibration that makes something look alive or create depth. And so this was to me kind of a visual summary of so much of the rigor and work and thought and discipline and depth that is put into writing. And for me with poetry, poems arrive to me fully formed. It comes as the word of a title or as a phrase, but I see something or I perceive something or I vibrate with something. And this story that is seeking to tell itself, that I am midwiving into existence through poetry, comes through with not a lot of thought. I could think till the cows come home, but that is not how I create poetry. And so for me, a visual representation in contrast of my poetic experience is this piece by an artist friend of mine whom I've collaborated with poetry and art. This is Wading in the River by Cynthia Rosen. And this to me is mind-boggling because you have a complete image here. And from an art, if any of you are artistic, and even if you're not, specifically artistic, the completeness of scene that she has been able to create with just a few very vigorously and impressionistically strokes of her palette knife create a universe of story. And so this is in the pieces of what is writing and what is poetry. I can't put in words, pictures are worth 1,000 words. This is it for me. So I thought that I would share one of the poems that I wrote, the ekphrastic poem that I wrote in response to this painting. And I work with ekphrasis a lot with small children and big children and everybody in between, because I really think that I've had a lot of people tell me that they don't know where to start with poetry. And, artists say the same thing. And I don't really have that problem, but there are a lot of people who just, the terrible part about creating art is staring at the blank white page and knowing where to start. So similarly with poetry, for those who might find it difficult to figure out what to write about or might not have an inspiration, I always recommend taking a look at a piece of art or listening to a piece of music or going to see a dance. And often that makes things pop. So this is the poem that I wrote in response to this piece. And my own, I started out, my evolution with the cartography of the unseen is that I come from a family that's highly intellectually developed, but we had no language of the emotional landscape. And so the unseen for me, and also the unspeakable, was the emotions. And so, as typical for a lot of early poets, poetry was the only way that I had to be able to express these things I didn't understand that were very much in contrast to my highly advanced and way above my age mind. I was like a complete child with the emotional landscape because I had no exposure to it. So poetry was my natural space. And then so that was the unseen landscape. And as I became older and older and had a sense of the universals, and as an international relations student, always sensed that there were universals connecting all cultures, and really knowing that the reality is that underneath all of these, this fever pitch polarity and divisiveness that we're seeing in the world today, that essentially we are more alike than we are different. And so my poetry is very much pitched to the universal. And so this is one of my cartographies of the unseen. And in this case, the unseen is that there's a whole story being told here. And this is my imagining of the story. My darling, will you fall, my darling, down the slope of my stooped shoulders in your delicate pink shirt? Or will you take a running start up the hills of my wisdom and leap with joyful abandon into the cerulean sea reflected in our humble river, the conveyor of my dreams? Will you roll in the dun sands of our river's shore, dear one, turning your white blouse into a sheet of papyrus on which you will write my history and a new constitution suitable to your time, when no girl is cut lest she fall prematurely and stain her white habit? Reflection mine, rippling with the distortion of arms stirring up silt in the cleaning, Have you dropped away from me, disappointed with the life I have made, straining to fly free? Or do you take comfort in my face familiar, replicated in a tiny pink shirt and a little white blouse, tumbling playfully into the water, laughter bubbling as the rich reeded flutes of my childhood floated downriver over falls after falls, stepping into the ocean of ancestors future and past? Let me hold you for a time, rocking you to sleep on the banks of the river before the falls sweep you out and away to the currents of your own shores. So this was a poem that I really, I saw such, a universal experience of motherhood in this image. And even though I don't tend to write about personal things, the trajectory of my relationship and the evolution of the cartography of unseen that was under the surface of the relationship with my mother is a story in itself. And I saw that story very much in this image. And I enjoyed building a story from the art that imagined a version of a mother that I wished I'd had, and have come to have more as we've gotten older. So I want to take a few minutes now, and of course, I'm happy to stay on in the after. I will honor the 8:30 cutoff point. And I did not know in this group whether we had seasoned poets, no poets, the spectrum of poets. So I just wanted to give an exercise that is what I do when I go. I tend to do this when I go out on the poetry of nature walks that I lead. And in this case, I actually consider nature the greatest masterpiece of artistic creation that we're fortunate to be surrounded with. So I consider nature poetry, ekphrastic poetry. And so if you would like to engage in just a little poetic exercise, I figured I'd triple whammy it and give a writing prompt that is ekphrastic, so springing from a piece of art, acrostic, which the kids that I work with who are 5 or 6 absolutely adore, and then memory, which for so many people, poetry is evocative of memory. And I think that's something also that, a lot of us will, I'm a huge, I'm a science fiction and fantasy fanatic. And so there are universalities that I relate with in that genre. I like historical fiction, I like autobiography, but there's a band of shared experience that I have in each of those genres. In poetry, it's just amazing how almost anyone who reads poetry, a memory that is relevant to their own experience is prompted by something corresponding or pinging in a poem. And so we're combining memory in this. So our exercise is to take our inspiration. This is a 3 foot by 3 foot painting that I created with palette knife. It's 9 separate paintings. I blew up the image and I cut them into 9 pieces and they got pixelated. And so this is 9 12-inch by 12-inch paintings put together to form a 10th whole. And so the invitation is to respond to this painting specifically around a memory, whether this pings a memory of a place for you or an experience with fire or, infinite possibility of relating with this painting through memory. And the invitation, the acrostic, as I'm sure many of you know, is when often it's with the little kids, we use their name. So, if their name is Randy, they write a poem where the first line starts with a word that begins with R, the second line with a word that begins with A, third line begins with N, and so on. And so in this case, I took as our acrostic spirit of poetry. And I've written it vertically so that the invitation is to write an ekphrastic or begin to write an ekphrastic response. And again, it doesn't have to be about this painting. It's simply what starts pinging and coming through for you as inspiration or memory when looking at this, specifically trying to write about a memory and to write your poem a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 line poem where each line begins with the letter that is in spirit of poetry. So we've got 2 minutes. So I will salute those who can super speed write a 14-line poem in 2 minutes. But let's at least just tackle some portion of this prompt in the time that we have left together. John Sun Love, I love your magicians / aliens. I couldn't agree more. Well, how fast 2 minutes flies. It is 8:30. So with respect to the time, I'm going to stop it there. I did not want to tell the title of the painting prior to the prompt because of course that can bias or shape the experience, but this painting is called Temple of the Sun. I'm going to stop sharing. And thank you so much for the invitation and Bernadette and Shirley for inviting me to be part of this presentation. And I hope that this little taste has given some sense of at least what the poetic life can be. There are ways, my evolution in cartography of the unseen is that I can tune into wanting to write a poem at will, and I just sort of flip that switch on through meditative practice and become one with the subject and let it flow. So thank you very much.
Well, thank all of you very much for coming in and giving us a look at what NMSPS is all about and your own journeys into poetry. It's very enlightening. I'm sitting here staring at that painting and I love the painting, and then I'm trying to figure out what kind of words could go S-P-I, let's see. I'm afraid I'm not really good at coming up with things that fast. So I wonder, is anybody out there able to come up with something, maybe just for the first word, spirit? Dan?
Yes, I kind of cheated. I did a lot of words on certain letters and just used minimal words on other lines, but what I came up with something from about 30 years ago. Scaling Mount Sanitas, purposing the together in aloneness, I ran headlong into the nexus of the night and your nearness. Overhead, fields of sun-drawn flowers poured down like so many fireworks, overflowing the evening in a tic-tac-toe of tones, rejoicing in you.
Wow. Very good. Anybody else get anything put together in 2 minutes?
I got something, but I think I misunderstood the prompt. And that's a tough act to follow, but I'll share.
Yeah.
Okay. Marcia, the days of traveling alone to Utah in between the spring and fall of teaching are gone. They are gone like Sandberg's buffaloes. Will you go with them, blindly wandering forward? Or will you mindfully, though spontaneously, choose your footholds forward? And that's about as far as I got in your ongoing path. I just finished that line. I didn't get, that's as far as, I couldn't write as fast as he could. And that was beautiful what the person before me wrote. So thank you.
As was yours. They're really wonderful. And that's something else to me. I came through so many rules. And so the prompt is a prompt. And to me, there is no misunderstanding of the prompt. You created something absolutely beautiful. And that's the beauty of a prompt is making it your own. So well done.
I wanted to say, I really liked what you said about, I think you said being a ball of sensory overload or something, because that would be me. So I really identified with that. Thank you.
John Sun Love, you've got one in chat. You want to read it aloud?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. Splattered on Mulholland Drive, pyro ejaculate sky, into the swerves I lilt, realizing some dream of a movie in which I know true love, the kind they make movies about.
Sweet. Mulholland Drive. Wow. Okay.
This is the other thing that I love about these exercises and about writing poetry is, you know, how vastly different, you know, we can spring from a similar exercise. And that's just, it's so beautiful that the responses are just as infinite as the possibilities. You know, all the various possibilities, putting together those letters and images. So it's yeah, it's a real pleasure to hear your experiences coming to Poetic.